Today's notes are going to be placed in the foldable that you were given at the beginning of the period. I'm going to start by showing you how to set up the foldable, like what to write on the front, and then I'll show you where you can write on the inside, and then we'll begin the notes. So let's start by setting this up. Just be aware as you're watching this, you can stop this at any time or pause it at any time so you can actually write the things that you need to write, and the video will not go on. So here's what the outside of your foldable is going to look like. So you're going to have executive branch as the title of the foldable, and then you're going to title each one of the sections. So you have structure, powers, hats, and influence policymaking. You do not have to complete yours in colored pencil. I just did it on mine that way so it would stand out for you a little bit more. So again, to set this up, you are going to want to pause the video so you can have it ready before you move on. Now that we have the foldable ready, let's talk about where you can put the information from the PowerPoint today into your foldable. So there are two options that you can take. When you open each section up, you'll notice that there are two spots where you can write. You can either write where my finger is pointing on this, like on the inside section, or you can actually write it on the flap itself. It doesn't matter which one you choose. My suggestion would be, however, that you only stay on that one. So like in other words, you don't go all the way across that section. So you either choose to write it in the inside or you write it on the inside of the flap. Whichever you choose is up to you. I do want you to notice that each of the sections are titled Structures, Powers, Hats, and Influence Policymaking. So when you go to do this foldable, you'll notice that the titles at the top of each screen tell you where the information goes. So we'll start today with structure. This will go in the structure section. Again, you can either choose to write it on the flap or you can choose to write it on the inside. It doesn't matter to me which one you choose. As you do this today, again, you will probably want to pause the video to make sure you get everything you need in the foldable. So the executive branch has several parts to it. Obviously, it has the President of the United States. He's the head of the executive branch. Underneath him, you have the Vice President, which is like his second-hand man. Then you have the cabinet. The cabinet actually has nothing to do with a cabinet in the kitchen or in any other room of your house. The cabinet is a group of 15 advisors that the president has to help him. And we'll talk about the cabinet a little bit later on in the unit. You have the regulatory agencies. These are agencies like the FBI or the CIA, and there are other ones as well that we focus on once we get to that point. And again, we'll talk about those on another day. And then at the bottom, you have the federal agencies, and technically the federal and regulatory agencies could be put together, so you could write it as federal and regulatory agencies. So again, you'll want to pause the video before you move on to the next slide. The next section will be powers. There are several of them. You can shorten them if mine is not shortened enough. I just don't want to lose the integrity of each one of them. So the main power of the executive branch is to execute the laws. In other words, he carries them out. And the way he does this is by signing them into law. You do not have to write enforces or carries out. That's just another way to say executes. He prepares the annual budget. This is like what he thinks money should be spent on in the United States. He appoints a cabinet, ambassadors, and federal judges. Again, we talked about what the cabinet is. We'll focus on it on another day. Ambassadors are those people that represent the United States and other countries. And then, of course, federal judges are part of the judicial branch. Just be aware that even though he prepares the annual budget and he appoints these people to their positions, Congress does have to approve them. He administers the federal bureaucracy. This is just a really big fancy way of saying that he manages the executive branch. And yes, you do need to write all of bureaucracy. He proposes legislation. He can do this in several ways, including the State of the Union address that he gives every year, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. In other words, he gets to give his ideas on what he thinks Congress should make laws on. He can also call special sessions of Congress. Congress does not meet 365 days a year. They only meet for a part of the year. And there are times when the president might need Congress to be in session, so he can call them back to session in Washington, D.C. An example of this might be the United States is attacked and Congress needs to make the decision of whether or not to declare war. Obviously, if they're not in session, the president would have to call them back to session. He can also veto legislation, which we've talked about what that is when we talked about how a bill becomes a law. Even though he vetoes, Congress can override it, although that is a difficult task to do. Again, you might want to pause this before you move on to the next slide. The next section we'll be in is the hats section. Just be aware or note that hats is in quotation marks, so these aren't real hats, but we call them the hats of the president because it's like different roles he plays as president. And we're actually going to take a whole day and focus on nothing but the hats of the presidency. So I'm just going to call them out today, and you're just going to put them in the foldable. Chief of State, Chief Executive, Chief Legislator, Commander-in-Chief, Chief Diplomat, Chief of Party, and Chief Citizen. Just be aware that the president has different responsibilities when he quote unquote wears each of the hats, although technically it's not really hats that he wears. So when he is playing the role of Chief of State, he'll have one responsibility, but when he moves to Chief Legislator, he'll have a different responsibility. And again, we'll talk about those on another day. Once again, you'll want to pause the video in order that you are able to get everything into the foldable before going to the next slide. One of the most important things the president does is to influence policymaking. He actually does this in 4 ways. He can propose legislation in the State of the Union address, as I mentioned a couple slides ago. And I do want you to write that whole statement. We'll talk about what the State of the Union is in a couple of days. He appeals directly to the people. And he does this by speeches he might give on television or by traveling to different parts of the United States to do the same. He approves or vetoes legislation. You already know what that is. And he can also appoint officials who help him carry out the laws. This is like his cabinet or members of the federal agencies. So once again, you will want to go ahead and pause this to make sure you get everything in the foldable. The next slide is the illustrations, which you will be doing across from where you're going to put the foldable in your interactive notebook. It's the blank page. So you're going to title the whole page Executive Branch and then divide it into 4 sections: structure, power, hats, and influence policymaking. For the structure section, you're going to draw a picture like an organizational chart. So like a box president, then another box vice president, so on and so forth. Then for power, you're just going to choose one of the powers on that page or on that part of the foldable and illustrate it. Just one. Then for the hats, you can choose one hat and illustrate it. Just what do you think the hat would look like if it was an actual hat? And then influencing policymaking, you're going to choose one of those options and illustrate it. So again, you might want to pause the video to be sure that you get all of these parts labeled in your notebook.